imagine you ask something like, what's the meaning of life? And I would say, well, you should reformat that question, because it's not a good question, because it implies that there's a meaning to life, a meaning. And perhaps there isn't a meaning. You could ask, well, where do people derive the meanings in their life? Well, you tell me, but I'll make a little list and see if you can add to it or object to it. You probably need a career or a job. Well, why? Well, because otherwise you'll starve and freeze. Like, it's a necessity. You have to generate enough to protect you from the elements, let's say, to protect you from privation. That's not a consequence of capitalism or anything foolish like that. It's a consequence of hunger and the need for shelter. Capitalism is an attempt to address that, not to cause it. And you could argue that another system might do it better, but even if you did argue that, you can't lay the necessity at the feet of capitalism. You need a career and a job, partly out of necessity, partly because we need to be of service to other people. We need to be of service to the community. It's a deep need for people, especially if they're conscientious and agreeable. You need to be educated to the limits of your intelligence. You need an intimate relationship. You need a family. You need friends. You need to take care of your mental and physical health. You need to regulate the effects that temptations have on you. And you need some sort of higher order spiritual or philosophical pursuit. Well, those are all socially mandated roles to some degree. And you don't want to demolish them because you're left with nothing. Having nothing is not a good place. It's not freedom. That's foolish to think that. Freedom is the ability to choose between jobs, let's say. Not to choose whether or not you have a job. There's some peace in fulfilling your roles properly. So you have a number of games which you chose to some degree voluntarily, but which are also socially structured. You find satisfaction and freedom from anxiety in playing out those roles properly. And that is what people are like. And demolishing those roles, criticizing them as purely oppressive, let's say, is not helpful because it leaves nothing. And that's a terrible state for people to find themselves in, to have nothing. You're very fortunate if you're constrained by a number of functional roles. It's what everybody needs. I mean, some people need less of that than others. If you're highly open in your personality, so fundamentally creative, and you're low in conscientiousness, so you don't like order, you don't need order, well, a little bit of structure goes a long way, but there aren't many people like that who are highly functional. It's also extraordinarily difficult to make your way in the world as a spontaneously creative person. It's very difficult to monetize that. Some people do it extraordinarily well. They're geniuses. Even they're very rarely economically successful. There are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. Really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? You could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned. That's for sure. But if people are in fact insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. God was viewed to rule being with two hands, the right hand and the left hand, and the right hand was justice. And that was, you're going to get what's coming to you. But the left hand was mercy. And the idea essentially was that the cosmos could not exist without the proper combination of justice and mercy. You should get what's coming to you. But people are fallible and they make mistakes. And so it's reasonable to apply that to yourself. You know, there's an idea that's been developed by psychologists over the last few decades that people are basically narcissistic and that they generally feel that they're better at most things than other people. I don't buy that. I don't think the experimental evidence for that is very strong, and I certainly haven't seen that, for example, in my clinical practice, where I've seen that people are generally far harder on themselves than they are on other people. And you think, well, why are people like that? And I think it's because they know themselves, they have contempt for themselves because of their flaws, and then they come to despise themselves. And I think that's a big mistake. That's too much justice and not enough mercy. And, you know, Jung wrote about the biblical injunction that you should treat your neighbor as if he were yourself, essentially. But he talked about that as an equation, which was quite interesting. So, because it's often read as something like you should be nice to people, which is not what it means at all. Because first, nice is a very low-end virtue, but it isn't what it means. What it means is that you should treat your neighbor as if he or she is someone that you wish to encourage and develop, but that you should also have exactly the same attitude towards yourself, which is sort of in some sense regardless of what your opinion is of yourself. Critical, let's say, hypercritical even, which is often the case with people who are anxious or perhaps who are hyper-conscientious. You have to put forward to yourself the same sympathy, we could say, that you would extend to someone else that you cared for. That's the thing, is that you have to come to treat yourself as if you're someone that you care for. And I mean that technically. You know, you detach yourself from yourself and you think, okay, well, if I was going to construct a mode of being that was optimal for this person that I happen to be, what would that look like? And that's sort of independent of whether or not you think you deserve it. It's like, maybe you deserve it and maybe you don't. Innocent until proven guilty, that's a pretty good policy. But you should come to lay out a mode of being for yourself that gives you some credit. You know, and that will also help you in your dealings with other people. But it's often very difficult for people to do that to themselves. Every time you make a status shift as you move upwards, of course you have imposter syndrome, because when you first make a transition into a new role, you are an imposter. Because you're a beginner, you don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you're a liar or a fake. And it doesn't mean you should presume more knowledge than you have. It's, what did Nietzsche say? Every great man is an actor of his own ideal. And that feeds into the imposter syndrome in some sense. If you want to move to the next stage, at some point you have to act like you're already there when you're just barely started. And that's not a lie. You know, it's the willingness, it can be, and it can degenerate into a lie, especially if you presume more than you know. And of course you're going to feel like you're an imposter if you have any sense, because you're just barely there. You just made the transition. That's okay. You know, that's not a problem. First of all, you have to understand that everyone with any sense who isn't narcissistic feels that. And it's actually an indication of your mental health and your competence, as long as that doesn't become crippling. It shouldn't knock you out. I'm such a phony. Well, don't be a phony. That's the first thing. If you're dealing with competent people and you admit your ignorance, the competent people never judge you harshly for that, as long as you've been paying attention. And so you can be ignorant You can be an ignorant newbie, and you can even ask the questions that are necessary to ask in that position and sort of reveal your inadequacy. And as long as you're dealing with competent people and you've been paying attention, they're just going to answer your questions. And then you only have to be ignorant once. That's the thing about asking a stupid question.